So my blue sky is this. It starts with hard to make learning happen if you haven't decided what it is. So we began by defining learning in the Common Ground Collaborative.
You're listening to the Blue Skies Leadership Podcast, featuring discussions with international school leaders about the future of education. The podcast embodies the spirit of reciprocity by sharing strategies and change initiatives from leading schools around the world. Here are your hosts, Dan Kerr and Daniel Mendes.
Okay, Daniel, let's get ready for another podcast episode. But listen, before we get going, I was in your office earlier today looking for you, and I saw that you had a copy of Greg McKeon's Essentialism on your desk. And that's one of my favorite all-time books. Are you reading that as well?
Yes, I read it. It pertains a lot to what we do as schools. We have a very complex job of lots of things going on in schools. And it was a perfect book for leaders like our listeners who need to make some strategic decisions of what's important.
Yeah, you know what? I honestly think that this should be essential reading for all leaders in schools. International schools, probably all schools, certainly quickly fall in love with all the amazing initiatives that are out there on offer for people. And I think initiative fatigue in schools is a very real thing if you're not careful. I think sort of burnout and those kinds of things are also something you have to be careful of, particularly in this day and age when we're really looking hard at the social, emotional health and well-being of people. And the idea of essentialism, bringing it down to what really matters, what are your top priorities, and the idea of simplifying your lives in schools seems to resonate with where we are in a world right now.
Absolutely. A systematic approach and really being tough and saying if it isn't a definite yes, it's a no, and being okay with that. And I think that's very important that schools say no, because then if you're saying yes to some things, then you're saying no to other things. And if we're saying yes to everything, then it just gets watered down.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of stretching your organization so thin that you can't really go deep and get really, really good at something. It fits in beautifully to our next guest, who is really a proponent of simplifying your lives and being very, very clear and intentional and strategic about the initiatives and how you're approaching education. And this week, our guest is Kevin Bartlett, who really is a true innovator, redefining the game of learning. Kevin believes that education should be more than memorizing facts and passing tests. It should be about developing well-rounded individuals who are good with ideas and good with skills and really good people. And full transparency, Kevin Bartlett has been an absolute mentor of mine since probably 2009, and it's a thrill for me to have him on this podcast.
Kevin has dedicated his career to creating learning ecosystems that empower both students and teachers. He was instrumental in the development of the IB Primary Years program and has co-founded two impactful organizations, the Next Frontier Inclusion and the Common Ground Collaborative.
Kevin's work focuses on building a common language and a shared destination for the entire school community. So parents, teachers, and students working together towards a clear vision of what's worth learning. So we're so excited to welcome Kevin Bartlett. Kevin, welcome to the show.
So no, it's a pleasure. It's good to see you again, actually, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you. I know you're busy with all things Common Ground Collaborative, so for you to take the time for us today really means a lot, and we're excited about the conversation. And I've always enjoyed your perspective on school innovation and where we should be headed as schools internationally. And I think I would just like to kind of put that question to you right now. Where do you think we should be heading, and what should we all be prioritizing to bring this vision to life? What does that look like, blue sky visioning from your perspective?
Despite the fact that we know that schools and hospitals are the two most complex human organizations, in a way it looks simple to me, Dan. I'll probably answer several questions at once by capturing everything in a kind of systemic response. Blue sky vision to me is a new system for schools. I think we have a profession that I am a great believer in. I'm a teacher. I've just taken on, interestingly for me, after all these years, 15 11th grade lessons a week, because the school I'm doing an embedded residency in lost a teacher, and I wanted to take on those kids. So,
oh, wow.
So I'm seeing this from the classroom. I'm seeing this as a leader. I'm seeing this as the leader of the Common Ground Collaborative. And it falls into place around a number of simple ideas. We approach this from the idea that leaders need to be good with questions, that we get stuck with the normative of the task we face. We begin to realize that everything's connected. And I think we panic when we see if we pull on that string, then the whole thing changes. So what I've done is say to leaders, to become a leader, you don't need to have all the answers, but it's really useful to have all the questions, all the good questions. In fact, I've often thought of defining leadership as the ability to bring the right questions to a community and lead that community towards answers that we'll all stand by. So in looking at Blue Sky, to me, we'd have a more systemic approach to learning, and I'll map that out as quickly as I can. I've always enjoyed the work of W. Edwards Deming, the guy who transformed the Japanese car industry after the Second World War, created total quality management. He said a bad system will beat good people every time.
Right.
And I think we're a profession full of good people. He also said, and I think this is a very gut level, powerful quote, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you don't know what you're doing. Even though that's kind of in your face philosophy, I actually believe it. So my Blue Sky is this. It starts with hard to make learning happen if you haven't decided what it is. So we began by defining learning in the Common Ground Collaborative. The question was, what is learning? And then I realized, taking that quote I just mentioned, that what we really needed to define was the learning process. When I was co-writing the ACE protocol for New England, we brought in the idea of learning principles. One of them was you had to have a learning definition. But I've seen that misunderstood a lot. People write a lot of beautiful things that they believe in about learning, which is fine. It's a good conversation. It's a good conversation to have. But if you're not careful, it sits alongside the mission statement as yet another kind of wall decoration and doesn't make much difference. I realized that what we had done was define the learning process. The question we had asked was, what's happening when we're learning? So one part of a big Blue Sky systemic change to me is to define the learning process. And we narrowed it down to what experts do. Experts are good with ideas, good with skills, and good people. So we came up with a process definition of learning as conceptual learning, competency learning, character learning. That new learning language has a beautiful simplicity. We teach it to kids, we teach it to parents. So 1/5 of my Blue Sky vision is define learning. What is learning? But then you can't learn in a vacuum. So you need to address the content issue. So the question we raised was, what's worth learning? And this is a really big thing now for me. And it's been always in my head alongside all the influences like Understanding by Design with Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, Project Zero, all of those people. It's the idea of transfer. It's the idea of starting with the end in mind. So our Define, which is actually our curriculum model, starts with what we call the portrait of a learner. And it describes 6 human capacities that I think would help kids go out and make sense of the world and help the world make more sense. I'm very heavily into conceptual transfer because it's concepts that transfer. You can't transfer facts. And I'll just mention the work of Julie Stern. I'm a big admirer of Julie Stern. Tanya Latanzio. I was just reviewing a book by Tanya, and I talked about us as toilers in the transfer trenches. The people who believe that what matters is what kids take away from an education.
Yes.
We chose our language carefully. An article, an adjective, a noun. So a rational problem solver, a respectful relationship builder. Our actual learning design starts with the end in mind. And then we built a content, actually scope and sequence is backwards from a conceptual framework, build the curriculum that will create that kid. And actually, I just did a post on LinkedIn where I showed how you can match the co-curricular program to that portrait. So it's no longer school and after-school activities. It's the portrait and curricular and co-curricular pathways to that portrait. Having defined learning as conceptual competency character, you design learning around a portrait of a learner, spiraling learning units with embedded conceptual competency character goals in them, linked together to pretty much guarantee that you produce that kind of learner. The third D I work with is diversify. I was a co-founder of Next Frontier Inclusion. I'm a big believer in very, very diverse forms of education. We have very neurodiverse faculties and staff and student bodies, obviously, and diverse in all kinds of different social ways as well. The third D we brought to the table was diversify. And the question we asked was, how does everyone access learning? The fourth D was deliver, which honestly, I don't like the word very much, but I needed a D for the system. But I like the question we put with it, which is, how do we build learning cultures? And actually, I'll come back to that because it's a big initiative in its own right. And then the final D was demonstrate, was how do we provide evidence of learning? Not how do we test kids, how do we provide evidence of learning? And I've been very privileged to work with Jay McTighe, who's honestly a hero of mine, for the last 2-3 years. And together we designed what we call the balanced assessment system. We just came back from Mexico City together where we did a 2-day workshop on that. So Blue Sky to me is an end in mind that creates kids who can go out and make sense of the world and help the world make more sense because they have a conceptual framework that transfers into any context.
Yeah. And with regards to Blue Sky vision in mind, I mean, I can see how that is absolutely different than a lot of the traditional models that we see currently in schools still around the world, even though that we've been thinking about change in these capacities for a long time now, but it just doesn't seem to be moving in a direction all that quickly.
It's interesting, isn't it? In the last webinar of our series on the learning culture that I'll talk about, we talked about the saying-doing gap. And I modeled it like this. What did we ever do about... Oh, I don't know. I remember we talked about it, didn't we? I think we talked about it at the beginning of the year. Yeah, we talked about it, but we mistake talking about something for having done something.
Yeah, that's so true.
We all talk about transformation. This is a good example of Blue Sky thinking. Is the end in mind what the kids take away to help them make sense of the world, or is it our exam results? Now, it doesn't have to be. I'm making a false dichotomy because I don't believe those are either ors. But what's the saying? Energy flows where the attention goes. If our attention is on exam results and grades, that will suck up most of our energy. If our attention is on giving the kids real world experiences that they can use in the real world, that's where our energy will go. And I think that's one of our biggest failings, is not closing the saying-doing gap. I have a hunch that, in fact, it's more than a hunch because I've experienced it. Get 50 leaders in a room from good schools, we'll all pretty much agree on what needs to be done. And then 45 of those people will go home and keep doing the opposite. And I think that's a dilemma for us. I think we're very stuck. I think we're very risk averse. Check the stats on how long international school leaders last. You can see why people are risk averse. But I think it takes courage and it takes clarity. You know, Brene Brown said clarity is kindness. I do something called the one-line job description. I ask people to introduce themselves. If you could introduce yourself in one line, and you may not use your job title, what do you actually do for a living? And mine is often, I try to bring clarity to complexity. So define, design, diversify, deliver, demonstrate. Don't get distracted by other things. Stick at it for 3 to 5 years. Bring everybody on board. And you see schools becoming very, very good schools. But we're bombarded by, you know, guys, you're in the same work as I am. We're bombarded by distractions, what Grant Wiggins used to call TYBT, this year's big thing. You know, everybody wants to convince us they have the silver bullet. I think the silver bullet's been staring us in the face forever. Simplicity of direction, defined learning. I think it's seeing things systemically, working in connected ways, getting everybody on board. Just find the simplicity. The thing is, it's all in the best of the books we read. All I'm doing now is talking as if I was Jim Collins in Good to Great.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Find your hedgehog principle, keep pushing at the same flywheel, get the right people on the bus. But then again, knowing, doing gap. We know that's what works. We often end up doing just the opposite.
Really appreciate your vision for schools. The common themes that I hear is simplicity. Remove the noise from the conversation that we have in schools. I'd love to hear more about Common Ground Collaborative Journey. And you're coming up on a 10-year anniversary of that work. And I'd love to hear more about your history, your journey.
It's a long history, but I'll tell the story quickly. Years ago, I initiated what became the IB Primary Years Program, and that's fairly well established now, and worked with the IB on that. We agreed to sign the intellectual property over for free to the IB, and I was asked if I'd like to chair their program committee, the IB PYP program committee. So I did that for a number of years on very good terms. The idea of a single continuum continued to nag away at me, and the idea of simplicity continued to nag away at me. And I thought, well, I'm good for one more go at designing learning. And so the CGC was founded at the International School of Brussels. And there was a key moment. I was very lucky. I was there for 14 years. I had 4 great board chairs, very good relationship with a 20-member board, so a big board, very smart people. I learned a lot. I like working with boards. And we had a retreat, and a facilitator came in and said, write the single most powerful vision you have for ISB on a Post-it and stick it on this board. Typical facilitator stuff. I do it myself. Stick it on a Post-it, put it on a board. And I wrote, change the world. Then we had to move our Post-its towards the Post-its that we gravitated towards. And about 5 board members were very intrigued by change the world. And that encouraged me to build what has become the CGC when I was at the International School of Brussels. And one very nice moment was when I left, that group of board members, almost unbeknownst to me, addressed the rest of the board in my absence and said, look, this was the vision. If Kevin takes this with him when he leaves the school, he'll have some chance of using it. We won't use it when he's not here. So this intellectual property belongs to him, and we're going to give it to him when he leaves. And I did, and they wrote a contract out. And at that point, when I left the school, we founded the Common Ground Collaborative. And it's a network of schools. It's very non-authoritarian. We don't brand schools. I never even call them CGC schools. That's not our style. It's kind of small-scale, bespoke, customized design of the school's own learning ecosystem, the one I've just talked about. And it's simply grown over the years, not particularly in size. We're not a huge organization, but the quality has been very deep because some people have stayed with us for a very long time. It's like staying at Brussels for 14 years. It's intriguing what you can achieve if you stick at something for a long time.
Yeah.
So it's almost been since we have founded more of the same, building the system with more and more schools, and increasingly kind of fleshing out that vision of 5 Ds that could form a system. So, for example, demonstrate, fully fleshed out now because of the partnership with Jay. It's been same vision, pursued for 10 years, fleshing it out, small refinements, and realizing that I can be more helpful to schools and school leaders in this position than I was as a school leader. A friend of mine who runs a school in Florida said to me, you know, Kevin, it's hard to work on school, in school. And I think that's right. And it's also simpler. It's hard to work on school, in school, because in school, you're bombarded with everything. I'm connected to schools, but I'm far enough outside them to say, you know what often works here, guys? You know what would make that simpler? It's been the original vision of change the world, simply pursued, as Jim Collins would say, I've pushed at the same flywheel now for about 15 years, 10 years officially, and before that just brainstorming and working with a great faculty in ISB and a co-founder, Gordon Eldridge. We started out together. We went our different ways for various reasons, but I should say that I didn't found it alone. I was helped enormously by Gordon, who's still at that school doing great work.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's been an inspiring journey. And I think most of us, a lot of our listeners have been, you know, either introduced to Common Ground Collaborative or have known of it or been intrigued by it for a number of years. So I'm glad you're still at it and probably another 10 or more to go.
Oh, 10, 20. I was thinking 2025 now. I mean, listen, I'm only 75.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, you're just getting warmed up.
If I can move to a specific part of the Common Ground Collaborative that I know you're working deeply on now, which really resonates with us as a school here at SSIS, because we are going down the road of trying to re-envision our supervision evaluation model to a growth and feedback model. And you're going to chuckle at this because you've seen schools try to get this right for years and years and years, and it seems like maybe nobody ever does. But I know you're going after something that really looks like it's a transformational growth and feedback structure. And I think you would call it a collaborative, evidence-based, impact-focused model of professional growth which casts leaders in the role of capacity builders and maybe a way of changing the learning game for good. And I know you've already delivered a couple of cohorts and you got another one coming up in February. Could you talk specifically about that part of the CGC and what your work looks like in that regard?
Yeah, I'd love to, Dan and Daniel, because it's interesting after all these years how things continue to fall into place. You puzzle away at the same dilemmas and another piece falls into place. Part of our role seems to have become notice, name, neutralize, notice, name, nurture. Notice the things that schools struggle with most, and on behalf of schools, tackle those dilemmas. Jay McTighe, I think schools struggle to have a complete, balanced, total assessment framework. So we went after that, and we created the balanced assessment system. Another thing that I think has never worked, I've never seen a school where I felt it worked, is teacher evaluation systems. And I've asked a number of people, very informally. When I was with Bambi Betts, who I love to bits, by the way, a plug for the genius of Bambi Betts, we ran an experienced principals summit. And I grabbed the opportunity and I said to 40 principals, just a quick whip round. We actually were sitting in a circle at the end of the sessions. I'm intrigued to know, which of you has ever worked with a teacher evaluation system that you think really works? How many hands went up? None. 0. When I was in Brussels, we worked out that the easiest way to write, and the easiest and best way to write a self-study for accreditation, was to bring the whole faculty into the gym for one day and write it all together at once. So I had 250 teachers in the room and said, while you're all together, I have one quick question for you before we leave today. We've done great work. Which of you has ever had your teaching really transformed by any teacher evaluation system you've ever experienced in any school you've ever been in? Mm-hmm. No hands out of 250 good teachers. So much so that I said, oh, honestly, the mic must not be working. You didn't hear the question. Let me repeat it. Same. So here's this kind of knowing doing gap. I don't know any teachers that think that supervision-based, observation-based, coming with the checklist of standards, whether you get them from Charlotte Danielson or, Strong, has ever transformed any teacher's practice. So what I started to do was decide to come up with an alternative, because it's easy for someone like me to be a big mouth and just criticize. But I think if you criticize, you have to come up with an alternative. But we started with that, actually, and I stumbled on, through a school startup I'm doing for a STEM school in Chicago, human-centered design. So we started applying human-centered design to this dilemma. You have to start with empathy. And I thought, well, it starts with empathy. I am truly empathetic to us teachers and leaders struggling with a system that deep down they don't actually have any faith in. And then you define the problem. So in the first of the webinars, we did exactly that. I just asked people, what's wrong with this picture? You wouldn't have joined this series if you were happy with the system. So what's wrong with it? Honestly, when you get through 3 pages of Google table with what's wrong with the current system, you kind of know you're onto something.
Yes.
So things like this. I know from working with Jay McTighe that any form of assessment to be reliable has to use multiple sources of evidence, but this is primarily usually observation-based. We know that observation changes the thing that's observed, yet we keep relying on observation. We know, because I teach it, I learned this from Greg Curtis when I did the ACE protocol with him, that you can aim for impact, output, or input. What teachers do is input. What we need to seek is impact. The only thing that really counts is what the kids are doing as a result of our work on teacher improvement. Yet we focus on the inputs, which is what the teacher is doing. There's a whole range of flaws in the current system that are quite easy to pick apart. It's narrowly observation-based, not broadly evidence-based. It doesn't empower teachers. It tends to be more fear-based when we actually know that we like to get good at something we care about. It makes us happy. So it should be more feel-good based than fear-based. It's input-focused, not impact-focused. It's sporadic. There's no agreed feedback system. We have a beautiful little feedback system we teach to all schools. We call it STAR, specific, timely, actionable, respectful. So we unpacked all the flaws, but here's the biggest thing. I'm a big believer in the work of Drucker and Fullen. So Fullen said, change is reculturing. Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yeah, I love that.
McWheatley said, it's only a culture if everybody buys in. So I'm thinking, hang on, if we are culture builders, and if everybody buys in, and if cultures share a language and a belief system, then surely we can define together as a faculty the beliefs and values that we can turn into learning principles that only make sense then if we turn them into learning practices. And if everybody buys in, then by definition, and this is the phrase we used to launch the whole project, it's what we do when nobody's watching. If I have to be watching a teacher to have them do their best work, we're doomed.
Right.
So we said, no, we are not going to start with an observation, evaluation, supervision lens. Even the term supervision is offensive to the idea of it's what we do when nobody's watching.
Yes.
Another simple key is this. In order to get better at something, we have to learn to get better at something. So we should be looking at all this through a learning lens, not an evaluation lens.
It's exactly it. The word evaluation brings up a certain connotation, and the word learning or growth model, because we're all on a journey, we're all growing to become better at what we do. That's a better model than an evaluation model.
Yeah, just the language in itself and is a reframe.
Yeah, and with a colleague of yours, Chad McGartlin, I've been unpacking language, the language we use. As soon as you say supervision, you've signaled a belief system. The belief system is, I hired you, but in order to get you to do good work, I have to supervise you. I don't believe that. I'm with Deming again, who said, quality is everybody's responsibility.
Well, that's the culture shift you're talking about, right? That has to be a shared language, shared understanding.
It's exactly that. So I said, no, what we will do is the hard yards, the year or two that it may take to build a learning culture. Now, as CGC, we go into schools and have great workshops to build that culture. I won't run you through the workshops, but it ends up with everybody expressing a message to their colleagues based on their own personal experience of learning, usually as a kid. Mm-hmm. Those messages, dear colleagues, from my learning experiences, we should all remember that. Those are distilled out into a set of learning principles, very clear. We add research to them, and we ended up with basically 10 strands that we were going to focus on. But in case that sounds overwhelming, I could also describe my job as getting people to whelmed, because we're always overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but we're rarely whelmed. So we've developed 10 sort of strands. I then added an early one for parents, calling that the first teacher. We're the second teacher. So 10 ways to describe what we want to see in our learning spaces, in our classrooms. But then I didn't define initially the teaching standards to get us there. I described what you would see kids doing in different learning cultures, and I called them transact, transition, transform, transcend. It's a bit like the rubric we use for the ACE protocol, where we had thinking about it, working on it, living it. The reason I called the first level transact is there are schools and classrooms, we've all seen them, where effectively a transaction goes on between teacher and kids. And the currency is information. I provide you with information. You feed it back to me through the test on Friday. I pay you back for that with a grade. You compile your grades into a GPA and it gets you into college. It's very, very transactional. And then there's a transitional phase where more inquiry is coming in, where kids are getting more freedom, more agency, working more collaboratively. And then we were able to describe, very simply, 5 learner experiences in a classroom that's truly transforming learning. And then I added a 4th column that is transcend, and it just says, having seen what our learners are capable of, what if? Now, I think it's easier for a teacher to look at descriptors of student behaviors, if you like, in a classroom and say, yeah, my classrooms kind of look like this, than it is for a teacher to look at evaluative standards and try to compare themselves with those, where there's always that fear element in it. So basically what we did was create a series of simple continua that describe impacts, not teacher inputs, collaborative learning. I'm a nature guy, so naturalist learning. I think we've lost a lot with a disconnect from nature. Inquiry-based learning, inclusive learning, What does it look like at a transactional level, at a transitional level, at a transformative level, at a transcending level? And then I thought, well, I have to acknowledge the teacher in all this. So to each of those continua, I added very practical. Here are the top 10 teaching strategies for doing collaborative learning. And here's a rich set of resources to go with it. So here's your toolkit. Another key thing is, and we've referenced this a lot in this session already, pick one of those things and do it together. Here's another painful discovery, the blindingly obvious. From John Hattie and others, we now know that collective teacher efficacy has the greatest impact on student learning. If we know that collective teacher efficacy has the greatest impact, why would we have teachers go off and write individual goals to do different things? That is, I referenced Gordon Eldridge earlier. One of my favorite Gordonisms was, he called that process letters to Santa Claus. We get the teachers to sit down and write their goals. It's Christmas time. Send them off to the North Pole. Nobody replies. Nothing changes. Next year it's Christmas again. There's just a logic to all. I think there's a logic to everything we do. So if we need collective teacher efficacy, then we should build it collectively. If we want to shut the noise out, we'll do one of those things every year. I could quote you schools, honestly, that have gone with the collective impact goal and made huge strides. One is EIS in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. I was there for 4 years with them, with my wife. They've come leaps and bounds by doing one thing a year all together. It's hedgehog principle. It's good to great. It's Dylan William. Great leaders know how to say no to good ideas because we've chosen the best idea. So to me, there's an inescapable logic behind all of this. And I've said it already. If collective teacher efficacy is the most effective thing, then we will have a collective growth system, and it will be based on regular feedback. Of course, the other thing is, if we're all trying the same thing, every faculty meeting can be rich with examples of successes and struggles, and you actually feel like you're making some progress instead of what did we ever do about?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. We talked about it, didn't we? You know, the saying doing gap. We know we're doing something about this because we talk about it and do it at the same time. So that's the essence of the system, is cultural continua that we all buy into, approached one at a time collectively, reduced down to what the kids are doing, and then helping each other get our kids to that. And, you know, sharing evidence of student learning through teacher portfolio, so it's no longer based on observation, although there's nothing wrong with good observation. I don't want to create false dichotomies. I hope that gives you a sense of why we're so excited about this. It does feel radically different. And the people we're working with, people like you guys, are pretty rigorous thinkers. I think they would have torn it to shreds by now if it kind of didn't work. So I'm very excited about it. I think it's something that we need, and it fleshes out our 5Ds pretty much completely now.
Well, thank you for that. That is exciting, and it gives us a lot to think about in our own particular context here at SSIS and with the work that we're going to be doing over the next couple of years. I appreciate that and the good work, and hopefully that leads us all to a different place.
I really appreciate this time with you, Kevin. You have an amazing way of distilling very complex things that we do on a day-to-day basis and into really simple, but yet very important points. I've written down so many notes here. I love culture builders, and notice, name, nurture. Just wonderful little nuggets for our listeners today. Where would our listeners find you? How would they contact you? What's the best way?
Through the Common Ground website, or I am on LinkedIn a lot, but also just email kevin@thecgcproject.org. And honestly, I'm having conversations all the time. I always say yes to conversations. Some of them come out of left field. Every single conversation, I find you learn something if you're always listening out for that little linguistic nugget. Or somebody said to me recently, if we think in sort of grammatical terms, what you're doing is taking a situation where the child is the object of the sentence and making them the subject of the sentence. And I thought, that is such an interesting way to think of that. So there's always like on school, in school. I really like capturing ways to distill out something deep and complex into something that everybody goes, oh, that's it, isn't it? So like I said at the beginning, I try to bring clarity to complexity. So if you notice that, that's very reassuring for me.
Yeah, we have. And we've been noticing that for a long time, honestly, my friends. Hey, we want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today. We are off to a House League event, and we're inspired by this. And we really hope that we can see you face to face and cross paths in the near future. And be well. And thank you for taking the time today with us.
Well, thank you, Dan and Jen. It's a real pleasure to see you guys. And we're all in the same struggle, aren't we? What my friend Martin Skelton used to call the good struggle. So we just have to keep up the good struggle, because you see progress if you stick at it long enough.
Enjoy the rest of your evening and your weekend coming up. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Skies Leadership Podcast. Do you know a specific leader who would be a great guest? Fill out all the details at blueskiesleadership.com.